Montparnasse Tower was one of Paris's only skyscrapers, and even though it didn't really fit with the architecture of the rest of the city, Adrian loved it, especially when it was lit up at night like this. Every other floor was highlighted in blue, but the 56th floor, where the gala was being held, was bright white. The whole building seemed to be vibrating light, compared to the other buildings surrounding it, which Montparnasse Tower was dwarfing. It still looked as magnificent as ever, and the few Parisians who were around kept glancing up at it. Apart from the guests arriving at the gala, stepping out of their chauffeur-driven cars and onto the small red carpets, the area was void of people lingering. It was dark now, and everyone knew that Paris wasn't safe at night. But as Adrian stared up at the tower, a thankfully happy memory came back to him. One of him and Ladybug, kissing on Montparnasse's roof deck as the sun set over Paris on his 18th birthday. He managed to smile. Adrian didn't know what Marinette's reaction to seeing him here tonight would be, but he was determined to show her how he felt about her. Just as he went to cross the road, a white limo pulled up to the tower's entrance and out stepped a blonde woman. Her hair was down, worn in loose waves, and the golden floor-length dress she wore glinted and reflected in the bright lights of the tower. She moved to the side, and another woman got out of the car. She was ginger, her hair pinned straight and halfway down her back, and she was wearing a turquoise tulle dress. Adrian smiled again. He knew exactly who these two women were. He crossed the road, dodging between the cars that were dropping other people off, and once he made it onto the small red carpet that Ada had laid out for their guests at the entrance to the tower, he called out to his old friends, "Chloe! Sabrina!" The two women turned to face him, and the three of them couldn't stop smiling. "Adrian!" Chloe shouted, and even though she was wearing heels, she ran to him and flung her arms around him. He wrapped his arms around her too, holding her tight. Marinette hadn't been the only one he'd abandoned. He'd left everyone behind, giving only Natalie an explanation. He knew he had a lot of making up to do, but maybe some of it wouldn't be so difficult. "I've missed you," he heard her say, and he squeezed her. "I've missed you too." She looked up at him, tears in her eyes, and he shook his head. "Don't cry. Your makeup is perfect. You'll hate me for ruining it." She just huffed, and as she took a moment to compose herself, Adrian welcomed Sabrina into a hug too. "You grew your hair," he said as he pulled away from her. "I fancied a change. Although short hair is probably easier to manage when I'm nursing." Adrian smiled. "You're a nurse now?" He knew Sabrina had wanted to do that when they were in high school, but he hadn't known if she'd carry through with her decision. "I've just finished my first year of school for it. I decided against it after high school, but Marinette inspired me." "Marinette?" he asked. Sabrina frowned. "You really haven't kept in touch with anyone." Adrian stared down at the pavement. "I know. I'm sorry. After my dad." "We understand," Chloe said, the tears from his surrogate sister's eyes now gone. "Tell me about Marinette," he asked, as he led the way inside the building, all three of them quickly flashing their invitations to the staff. "She and Ivan are both student doctors," Sabrina said, the quiet hum of conversation from people waiting for an elevator drifting over to them, and the heels of the two women clicking on the marble floor. "It's lots of hard work, but they're both amazing." "Wow, I thought they both have jobs to do with the environment." Sabrina frowned. "Yeah, but with everyone getting injured by the gangs and other criminals, they decided to help another way." Adrian nodded. He understood. Paris was no longer heading the climate agreement, and right now, in the city, it seemed more urgent matters were at hand. The three of them arrived at the elevator bank, and the small crowd that had gathered to wait turned to look at the newcomers, and their eyes all widened when they saw Adrian. Mr. Agrest!" one of them exclaimed, and Adrian gave the man a tight smile. "Good evening." The elevator doors opened, and the small group who were there first got in the lift, and the man who had spoken to Adrian pressed the door's close button before he, Chloe, or Sabrina could even start moving to get inside. The attendant who was standing inside the elevator reached out and stopped the doors from closing. "Sir, we can fit these 3 extra guests inside." The man shook his head and everyone else started to whisper, "We can't, no room, sorry." As he said it though, his gaze kept darting over to Adrian, and he looked scared. With a sigh, Adrian took a step back. "It's okay. We'll wait for the next one." The attendant smiled and removed his hand, allowing the doors to shut, and the 3 former classmates were left in silence. "What on earth was that about?" Chloe asked. "People are scared of me," Adrian said. "I've barely been back a day and everyone already thinks I'm like my father." Chloe tutted. "That's ridiculous, utterly ridiculous. You're not brave enough to go around drugging people." Adrian chuckled. "Thanks, Chloe." Another lift arrived then, and the 3 of them got in. "So," Adrian said once the doors had closed, "Sabrina's training to be a nurse. What about you, Chloe?" The blonde girl smiled. "Nightclub owner. Well, I say nightclub. More of a lounge. Exclusive, you know. Classy." Sabrina's my manager. It's helping to pay for school, Sabrina explained. And Chloe's great with fitting my hours around my classes. Never thought you'd be someone's boss, Adrian said. Moi, Adrikins? Why, I'm practically made for that job. I'm great at bossing people around. Adrian raised his eyebrows. Yeah, I know, he said, which earned him a giggle from Sabrina and another tut out of Chloe. Anyway, she said, ignoring his comment, you should pay us a visit one night. Daddy let me use the basement of the hotel for it, so the location is super central. We make good profits. I'll be sure to go. The elevator stopped them, the doors opening, and the attendant who'd been in the lift with them smiled. Please enjoy the gala, she said, and then Adrian, Chloe and Sabrina stepped out into the party. The 56th floor of Montparnasse was already packed with people, the women wearing gorgeous gowns and most of the men wearing three-piece suits. Natalie had laid that out for him too, but he'd left behind the tie and waistcoat, wearing just a simple pair of black dress pants, a black blazer and a white shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. The only thing he'd put effort into was his hair, slicking it back, a few strands escaping at the sides like they always did. It was how he wore his hair when he'd been Cat Noir, and even though his hair was shorter on the back and sides now, the hairstyle would still be recognisable to Marinette. Maybe it was too much, but he needed to let her know that he still cared about her, still loved her. He would give anything to hold her again. The three of them handed their invitations to the attendant stood at a small booth by the elevators, but once Adrian saw the microphone clipped around the man's ear, his shoulders sank. He knew what was going to happen. Announcing the arrival of Chloe Bourgeois, Sabrina Ray Comfrey, and Adrian Agrest. The room had been filled with light music, talking, laughter, even the light clink of champagne flutes, and everything but the music stopped as the majority of the occupants in the room turned to stare at the elevator bank. Adrian looked at the floor, noticing how the silver flecks in the grey tiles sparkled in the bright lights of the room. He shouldn't have come. He should have just asked Alia to set up a meeting with Marinette. He loved her, but he couldn't do this. Chloe was unfazed though, and she linked her arm through Adrian's before starting to make her way through the crowd. Adrian tried to resist her, but Chloe was relentless, pulling him with her. Chloe, he hissed, what about your reputation? She just smiled. Like I care, Adrikins. She turned her attention to the rest of the room then. Oh, good evening everyone, she said. I know, I look stunning, but please, continue your conversations. I'm not worth ruining your marriages for. Well, maybe I am. Just a little bit. She tossed her hair slightly, and after earning a few chuckles from the men closest to them, the activity of the room resumed. Adrian felt himself relax a little, knowing he was no longer the centre of attention, but it was like he could feel eyes boring holes into his back. He knew he wasn't welcome here. Chloe, thank you, but I think I should go. Nonsense, she said, finally letting go of him now they'd reached the bar. This whole floor of the tower was reserved for galas and other parties, and as such, they'd installed a small bar directly opposite the elevator bank. And like the rest of the company's furnishing, it was all glass and gunmetal. It was obvious Ada's design team had constructed this too. Everyone will get used to you soon, Sabrina said from his other side with a smile, having followed them across the room. I hope so. 3 glasses of champagne, Chloe shouted over the noise of talking in the room, as well as more announcements of guest arrivals. But then Sabrina called please after her, and Adrian smiled. These two were lost without each other. Once they were served, Sabrina left to mingle, but Chloe stayed with Adrian and they stood to the left of the bar, beside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Even from the inside, Montparnasse Tower dwarfed the whole city, the lights of the nearest building hardly piercing the darkness from all the way down here. The only thing that could match Montparnasse was the Eiffel Tower. He could see it from here, standing tall and proud and golden, despite what this city had been put through. Are you okay? Chloe asked, her voice uncharacteristically soft and quiet. It seemed the years here with all this crime and violence had mellowed her a little. I will be. Just nervous about people's reactions to me. A girl spat at me on the metro. All softness vanished from the blonde woman's face. Did you get a picture? I'll ring her. It's fine, Chloe. I'm just wondering who else to expect tonight. I assume Max is okay with me being here, hence the invites. Unless it was his mum? What about Zoe? Is she here? Adrian hadn't heard her name being called yet, but there was only one name he was really listening out for, assuming Marinette hadn't already arrived. Chloe rolled her eyes at their mention of her. My half of a sister is at some thing. I don't know. Look, she doesn't matter. You being here does. Are you well enough to be back? Adrian sighed. I don't know, but I'm going to try. I have to try. For... He trailed off, the shape of Marinette's name left in his mouth. For Dupen Cheng, Chloe finished for him. You're so predictable. Now, Chlorine. Miss Dupenchang is an excellent designer. Another of her collections is being featured in the next issue of Style Queen. Adrian smiled, and then turned around and saw Audrey Bourgeois, still wearing her signature sunglasses even though it was late at night. Although the source of his smile had more to do with Marinette. She'd made it as a designer. She'd done it. Good evening, Mrs. Bourgeois. Adrian, nice to see you again. Will you be going to visit your father soon? Any hint of good mood that Adrian had managed to feel faded then. Mum, Chloe hissed. Oh, shush, Claudette. Here. Audrey handed Chloe her empty glass. Get me a refill. Chloe rolled her eyes but took the glass regardless, leaving Adrian alone with Audrey. She hadn't changed a bit in appearance, and considering the name she still called Chloe, it was obvious her attitude hadn't either. Your father wishes to see you. Adrian shook his head. I don't think I can. Audrey pursed her lips. It was always hard for Adrian to tell what she was thinking or feeling when he couldn't see her eyes. You are important to him. Adrian shook his head. If I was so important to him, he wouldn't have drugged innocent people. You know Manon is still recovering? She was only 7. And Chris? Adrian shuddered. He would never forget that day. Your father did it for you. He just stared at Chloe's mum for a moment. For me? All that chaos and death and devastation? I'm sorry, Mrs. Bourgeois, but I failed to see how it was for me. You can find out if you like. Audrey lowered her sunglasses then, showing just a hint of her eyes. And they were just as beady and calculating as they'd been when he was a teenager. I run... let's call it an organisation. Style Queen? Audrey smiled. I mean in addition to my magazine. Chloe is joining soon. Perhaps she would be interested. Adrian narrowed his eyes. I don't understand. Oh, it's discreet. Extremely. Almost secret. But what's it for? Oh my god, Adrian! He was leapt on them by none other than Lila Rossi, and Adrian's champagne flute nearly went flying. He managed to keep hold of it, and then gently prized Lila's manicured fingers off from around his bicep. Hello, Lila, he said. She gave him a wide smile, just as fake as the one she had given him in high school. He may have grown up sheltered after what had happened to his mum, but he'd still been able to peg Lila as a liar the moment she opened her mouth. He knew she was just an attention seeker, probably starved of affection at home, but so was he. And the only lies he told were the ones that allowed him to go change into Count Noir. A fond smile played on his lips. It had been a while since he transformed into his alter ego. Oh, you're smiling, Lila said, tossing the triple braid her hair sat in over her shoulder. You miss me? I know you did. She reached out and poked the tip of Adrian's nose as she said it, and he took a step away from her with a nervous laugh. I missed everyone. Well, I know you missed me the most. We have to catch up. How about a date? You're single, right? She asked, pushing out her chest as she spoke, the sequins on her grey dress catching the lights. Adrian let out another nervous laugh. Yes, he was single, but he was hoping for a reconciliation with Marinette, not a date with the girl who used to make up lies about the woman he was in love with. Well, if it isn't Adrian Agreste. Adrian smiled in relief when he heard Kim's voice, but the smile became genuine when he saw his former classmate was holding out his fist. Hey Kim, Adrian said, bumping his knuckles to Kim's. He knew not everyone would be so open to him being back, but so far, the gala had been largely a breeze. Miss Rossi, Audrey said, grabbing Lila's wrist. There's an interesting piece of artwork I must show you in here, but Audrey didn't listen and simply pulled Lila away, the girl stumbling after her on her 2 high heels. She hasn't changed a bit, Kim said, then took a sip from his own champagne glass. You haven't seen her recently? Adrian asked. No, I've been to the past 2 galas, and she wasn't here. I'm not sure why she's here, actually. I don't know what her job is. Kim shrugged and downed the last of the champagne he had. Oh well, maybe she's a +1, like me. Oh, whose? Max's. Adrian nodded. It's nice to see you're still best friends. Kim chuckled. Markov is his best friend. Max is my boyfriend. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know. Kim hummed. I didn't expect you to. How have you been? The blonde sighed. Honestly, I don't know. It must be difficult. Adrian nodded. It is, but I don't want to talk about it. What about you? No offense, but you, don't sound that stupid anymore? Kim laughed. I think I just had some growing up left to do. And, I had my own little trauma. He told Adrian about his career-ending leg injury and how bad things had got. It was awful, but I think it helped in a way. Put things in perspective for me. And today was my first day working for the police. Adrian smiled. Congratulations! He knew the Paris Police Department were corrupt, but maybe Kim, who was far more level-headed than he'd been in high school, could do some good. God knows the city needed it. But any thoughts of rekindling his friendship with Kim left Adrian's head as he listened to the next announcement. Announcing the arrival of Luka and Marinette Dupencheng. Adrian's heart felt like it had stopped beating at that moment. He had kept hearing the announcements as he chatted to Audrey and Lila and Kim, but this was the only one he'd cared about hearing. He shoved his champagne into Kim's hand and started making his way through the crowd, back towards the elevator bank. Adrian wasn't sure who he pushed aside or whose designer shoes he stepped on. He didn't care. He had to get to her. He had spent far too long without Marinette. And then he saw her, and Adrian couldn't take his eyes off her. He had pictures of her on his phone still, and she was all he saw in his dreams. He knew what she looked like, but she seemed even more beautiful than he'd remembered. Her bluebell eyes, the ones he'd always adored, were shining under the bright lights of the room, and her hair was longer now, reaching her mid-back in soft waves, and her dress was gorgeous. Or rather, she looked gorgeous in it. It was red, of course it was, and it was made of silk, and it fell over her body like water. The bodice was tight and held up with thin straps, and the skirt went from her waist to the floor, but the way the fabric curled around her legs as she walked made it seem like the dress was never ending. She was beautiful. He couldn't take his eyes off her. Not to mention the necklace she still wore. The little Ladybug pendant he'd given her when he was a child. The one she'd worn every day growing up. The reason why she'd chosen Ladybug as her hero name. Despite everything, she still wore it. But then the sparkle in her eyes vanished and panic took over her face, and then the next moment she was gone, turning around, going back past the lifts and towards the emergency stairs. "Marinette!" Luka called, and Adrian finally registered the other man, the one who had escorted his girlfriend, his ex-girlfriend, into the party. Adrian knew he was furious and jealous, and that he wanted to punch Luka, but he also knew he had no right to feel any of those things. He had left Marinette. She was allowed to move on. But didn't Alia say Marinette was single? And if she was with Luka, then why was she leaving roses on Adrian's old school desk? But that didn't matter right now. He'd think about it all later. He couldn't let Marinette get away from him again. He pushed through the last of the crowd and Luka saw him then, and the older man, his dyed turquoise hair slicked back for the chic event, shook his head. "That's not a good idea, Adrian. Fuck off, Luka." He pushed past him and ran for the emergency stairs, glancing down and then up. Up ahead, he saw the sweep of red silk, and he started running after Marinette, her heels clicking on the stairs. He knew she wanted to leave, and normally he'd do as she wished, but after 3 years, he had to see her and explain properly. He finally burst through the door that led onto the roof deck, and Marinette was stood in the centre, her back to him. The roof deck was completely empty apart from the two of them, and all the way up here, it felt like they were the only two people left in the world. Adrian could barely hear the noise of the city they'd left behind down below. The yellow lights that lit up the roof deck shone on the silk of her dress, and the fabric shivered as she moved. And that was when Adrian realised her shoulders were shaking a little. Was she cold? Or was she crying? "Hi, Bugaboo," he called, finding his voice was a little croaky. He'd been dreaming of the moment when he'd finally see her again for months, but he didn't imagine he'd be so close to tears that it would show in his voice. But it wasn't a surprise. He'd been in love with Marinette since he was a child. She turned around then, and even though her eyes were narrowed, the hate in her expression clear, he could see the tears in her eyes too. "You don't get to call me that anymore," she said, her voice hard. But even so, her voice. Adrian had listened to all of her voicemails the day of Fu's funeral, deleting every single one of them. He was already on the train, getting out of Paris. He couldn't go back, no matter how much he loved Marinette. So he'd slid the back of his phone off, took the SIM card out, and snapped it. All these years, he'd missed the sound of her voice so much. "I'm sorry, Princess." Marinette's glare deepened at the use of her childhood nickname, but Adrian just wanted to go to her, to hold her in his arms and kiss her and make sure she was okay. Having to stand so far apart when she was so close was agony for him. "I mean it," he said. "I really am sorry. For everything." Marinette shook her head. "Sorry isn't good enough," she said, her voice coming out cracked too. Adrian knew she was about to cry. "I know," he said, taking a step towards her. "But I needed to say it." "And what do you expect me to do now?" she asked, her voice close to shouting. "Say that it's okay? That I forgive you for leaving without saying a word?" "No," Adrian said, his voice feeling like a whisper compared to hers. Seeing Chloe, Sabrina, Kim, and even Lila again had gone smoothly. He didn't expect seeing Marinette again to go amazingly well, but he didn't think she'd be so angry with him. But at the same time, he understood. If the situation had been reversed, he would be reacting the same way if she had abandoned him. "Then what?" she shouted, stepping towards him. But Adrian was sure it was out of anger rather than wanting to be closer to him. And even angry, she was still beautiful. She was the only beautiful thing left about this city. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she asked. She was shouting at him. Yet he was still able to look at her with so much love in his eyes. Marinette knew she was still in love with him, but right now, she was too angry to care about that. She didn't know he'd be here tonight, and if she had done, she wouldn't have bothered turning up to the gala. While she just wanted to run into his arms, she also knew she wasn't ready to see him again. But here he was. He'd come back to Paris, chased her, and now was staring at her like he'd bring her the moon if she just said please. "I love you," he said, and Marinette immediately shook her head. She loved him. So much. Her feelings for Adrian had only grown stronger the longer they were apart, but she knew that he didn't mean it. If he loved her, he wouldn't have left her. "No, you don't." "I do," he said, and he sounded so sincere. It took everything in Marinette to not move closer to the man she was in love with. "There was nobody else," he continued. "You were all I thought about for 3 years." "Then why didn't you come back until now?" she shouted, finally starting to cry. It felt like these past 3 years spent completely alone had been leading up to this. "Marinette," he said, the yellow lights of the roof deck showing the tears shining in his green eyes. "I couldn't. After my father. It was too painful. And don't you think you were hurting me?" She knew it was selfish as she shouted it, but she couldn't help herself. She understood why he'd left all those years ago. If it had been one of her parents who had done what Gabriel did to Paris, she'd probably have left the country in shame, let alone the city. But it didn't explain why he'd chosen to ignore the girl, now woman, he supposedly loved. Adrian bowed his head, strands of his slicked back blonde hair falling forwards, the same strands that always tickled her cheek whenever Cat Noir craned his neck so he could kiss her. "I know," he said, "and that wasn't my intention. I love you and I thought about you every single day, but when I did, I was just reminded of everything that had happened here. I had to heal Marinette." Adrian blinked a few times, making sure his tears were gone, and took a couple of steps towards her. There was only a metre of space between them now. "Please, Marinette," he said. "We were together once." He reached out with one of his hands, but she took a step back and turned away from him, her back to him once more. "Were" being the operative word. "I don't love you anymore." Her voice shook as she said it. She didn't like lying, but she couldn't be with Adrian. Yes, she did love him, but she couldn't be with someone who had hurt her so much. He'd done it before. He would do it again. "I don't believe you," he said, and she kept her back turned. He had always known when she was lying. That hadn't changed. "Look me in the eye and tell me you don't love me anymore," Adrian said. Marinette's hand shook, but she gripped the silk skirt of her red dress. She wouldn't lie to him, but she wouldn't break her resolve. "There was never anyone else," he continued. "Nobody else. Only you, Marinette." She closed her eyes. He was saying everything she wanted him to say, but she couldn't do this. It was too late for them. Marinette simply bowed her head to the floor, turned around, and walked past Adrian and through the door she entered in. Adrian stared after her, and when she was gone, he sighed. She was angry. He knew that. He had always known she would be, but he knew she was lying. He knew that she still loved him. She always had done, even before their first kiss. Cat Noir heard the knife moving through the air before he saw it. He wore Kevlar ears atop his head, and they were connected to the wireless noise-cancelling earphones he was wearing too, and all sound was fed to him as it was filtered in through the microphones in the cat ears. They were as sensitive as a cat's, meant for the purpose of being able to hear danger before it arrived. He hadn't had much use for it. Until now. "My lady!" he shouted, jumping in front of her before the throwing knife could hit her square in the chest, and he took the hit instead, the knife embedding itself into his side. He fell to the floor with a hiss, but clasped the hilt of the knife. The blade needed to stay inside. He remembered his training from Master Fu. Bullets, or knives, staying inside were the only thing that kept you from bleeding out. Ladybug glanced down at him, and after the flash of fear had crossed her eyes that even he could identify despite his night vision, she reached down and pressed the ring he wore, alerting Master Fu that they needed medical aid. Then she grabbed his baton and simply stepped over Adrian with a smile on her face. "You're not getting the drugs, Bug," one of the gang members spat. And even though the abandoned building they were in was dark, lit by only a few naked bulbs, Cat Noir could see the spittle flying as he spoke. "No?" she asked. "We already know where you hid them." "She's bluffing," another member said, and they all stepped closer to her. There were 8 of them, 1 of her. and Cat Noir could do nothing. He could feel the blood starting to seep out of the slash leather of his costume, leaking around his diamond-tipped claw gloves. He let out a small groan in pain. It couldn't end like this. "Am I?" she asked, taking the yo-yo from around her waist. When she was Marinette, she was more often than not shy and anxious, unless she was around the right people. But when she was Ladybug, she was so confident. And Adrien loved both sides to her. She was amazing, but he didn't know if they'd make it out of this for him to tell her that. Your boss owns 3 cinemas in the city. The cocaine is being stored in the base of the seats. Rena Rouge and Carapace have already tipped off the police. The cocky look on the faces of the gangsters all melted away and Cat Noir smiled. His lady was always right. "Doesn't mean you'll be making it out of here alive," another one said, and then they all went for her. In any other situation, a 16-year-old girl would have been torn apart by these men, all taller than Marinette and their large muscles covered in tattoos. But his lady whipped her yo-yo around, knocking 2 in the neck in quick succession, the hard shell casing hitting against their Adam's apple, which sent them scrambling to the ground. The other 6 dived in then, and the only way Cat Noir was able to still see his Ladybug was because of her red and gold heroine costume. She was moving fast, the gymnastic training she'd been having since she was a child helping her with her agility, and the extra strength training they'd done making up for everything else that she lacked. She was kicking and punching the men, aiming her yo-yo and his baton at their necks and groins. It only took 2 minutes for her to leave all the men on the floor groaning in pain, but for Adrien, it felt like it had lasted 2 hours. He knew Marinette was good at her job, and Master Fu wouldn't have let any of them out to fight crime if he had any doubts. But that didn't mean Adrien didn't feel like he was going to have a heart attack whenever he saw the girl he was in love with in danger. Ladybug came back over to him then, and any cockiness she'd been wearing on her face during the fight had disappeared, replaced with anxiety. "Kitty?" she asked, grabbing the hand that wasn't holding the knife in place. He grimaced and squeezed her hand, making sure the sharp diamond tips of his gloves didn't cut into her. "I'm sorry," he said. "What for? You saved me, but I couldn't help you in the fight." Ladybug shook her head. "I had it handled. But I'm supposed to help. I'm your second in command and—" He tried to sit up as he spoke, but the action moved the knife still embedded in his side and he cried out, "Don't move, don't move! Please." Adrien heard the thick sound of her voice then, and he looked at her face. There were tears in her eyes. "Bugaboo, I don't think you'll die from this injury, but even so. And the leader, you got hurt on my watch. That should never have happened." Cat Noir squeezed her hand again. "I do it again, my lady." She tried to blink away the gathering tears, but she was unsuccessful, and a few fell. "Kitty, I can't lose you. Not after I found you again." "Marry," he whispered, making sure his voice was as quiet as possible. The gang members were down, but not out. They could probably hear them still. "I can't lose you either." She glanced away, her fringe covering her eyes. "You'd be fine without me." He frowned and let go of her hand, only so he could reach up and gently cup her cheek, turning her back to him. "I am nothing without you. You are my other half. I was made for you." He didn't want to wait any longer. He had been separated from Marinette from the ages of 4 to 16, and in their line of work, he didn't want to risk her not knowing how he truly felt about her for a moment longer. He watched as Marinette's lips parted in surprise. "What are you?" "I love you." More tears gathered in her eyes, and then she smiled. "I love you too." His hand moved to the back of her neck, and slowly brought her head down to his until their foreheads were touching. "Can I kiss you?" he whispered, able to feel his heart beating fast beneath the leather of his costume. She nodded, and tilted her head forwards, letting their lips meet. Adrien didn't imagine his first kiss happening like this, while led on the dirty floor of a warehouse, bleeding out of his side, and with 8 unsavoury men moaning in pain, but it was still perfect, because every time he had imagined it, it was Marinette who he was sharing it with. And she was here, and she loved him, and she was kissing him finally. Ladybug pulled back with a smile, the blush on her cheeks almost as red as the costume she wore. She opened her mouth to speak, but then a car horn beeped outside. Master Fu was here. "Can you stand?" she asked. "I might need some help." Marinette came around the other side of him and slipped her arm under his body, holding her hand to the wound to keep the knife in place, then brought his arm so it was around his shoulders. "Lean on me," she said, rising slightly, and he did, knowing she could take it. She'd thrown him to the floor last week in training. He winced as they rose up from the floor together, but allowed Marinette to take the lead, as she always did, and they made their way out of the building to where Master Fu's beat-up green Volkswagen Beetle was waiting for them. The old man was leaning against the steering wheel, but when he saw the two heroes leave the building, he got out and opened the back door of the car. "Thanks, Master Fu," Ladybug said when they were close enough, and under the street lamp, Cat Noir saw the man, who usually wore DuPont's janitor uniform, was now wearing a hooded jacket, as well as a green mask to hide his identity. "Let me see," the older man said, and Ladybug lifted her hand away from the wound, and Cat Noir winced. Seeing just how much he was bleeding in the proper light seemed to amplify the pain. "You will live. I have called Mr. Cubdell. He's on his way to the school to help. In the car. Now." Master Fu climbed back into the driver's seat, and Marinette helped Cat Noir awkwardly shuffle into the back seat without aggravating his injury too much. And once he was settled, she slid in next to him, on the side opposite to his injury. Once she shut the door, Master Fu started the engine, and after a moment of driving, Adrian felt Marinette's hand next to his, and then she was holding it. "Is this okay?" she whispered, not wanting their mentor to hear. But he probably wouldn't have been able to anyway. His car was old, and the engine was loud and rattled. And besides, Adrian was pretty sure Fu already had a pretty good idea about how he and Marinette felt about each other. He always seemed to know everything. Cat Noir nodded and squeezed her hand, and then turned his head so he could kiss her on the cheek. She immediately blushed and Adrian chuckled. She'd just beaten up 8 men with a yo-yo and a metal stick, completely fearless, and now she was shyly holding his hand. Her blush got worse. "Sorry, I've never done this before. That was my first kiss." It was mine too. Marinette looked over at him, surprised. "Really? I just thought, well, it's you! You're so handsome." Did I say that out loud? Adrian laughed and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You're beautiful, princess." He let go of her hand then, only so he could wrap his arms around her shoulders and bring her closer to him, her chin resting against one of the odangos she wore atop her head. Even though he had a knife sticking out of his body, right now, everything felt so perfect. The first Akuma victim was infected the week after. Could it ever get back to that? Adrian sighed again. He had no idea, but he was going to try. The roof access door opened, and he smiled, hoping Marinette had come back, but instead he was met with her date, and the smile vanished from his face. "Where's Marinette?" Luka asked. Adrian just scowled. "Didn't I tell you to fuck off?" Luka just rolled his eyes. "Adrian, don't bother. Do you think I want to talk to you when you're dating Marinette?" Adrian knew Marinette was lying, that she still loved him, and he knew that Alia had said she was single, but that didn't mean something hadn't started between Marinette and Luka during today, despite how she still felt about Adrian. "I'm not dating Marinette," Luka said, stuffing his hands in the pockets of his dress pants, creasing the bottom edge of his blazer. Adrian just stared at him for a moment, and then said, "But why? I got invited to the gala because of my work in the city. I run music therapy sessions to help people affected by Akuma. Zoe, my fiancée, was meant to come with me, but something came up. I knew Marinette was going. She's a fashion designer. Of course she gets invited. We decided to arrive together. That's it." "Oh," Adrian said, suddenly calm. He'd been unable to control his jealousy at the thought of anyone else being with Marinette, especially Luka. "Sorry about, swearing at you." Luka gave him one of his lopsided smiles. "It's fine. I understand. But I know nothing could ever happen between me and Marinette. I had a crush on her when I was 16, and the whole time I knew it was pointless because of the way she looked at you. The way she still looks at you," he added at the end, and Adrian returned the smile. There was still hope for him and Marinette. "I guess it must be hard, considering," Luka said with a shrug. "Considering what?" Adrian asked. "Oh, you know." "No?" Adrian insisted. "Really? Luka, please stop being so vague and just say it, and don't give it to me in a musical-themed metaphor. Tell it to me straight." Adrian knew he'd been rude to Luka tonight, but after his disastrous conversation with Marinette, and the way almost everyone at the gala was glaring at him, he just wanted to go home. "I mean, it must be hard since Marinette is Gabriel's master designer." Adrian just stared at Luka in disbelief for a moment before he said, "She's what?" "That's not a good idea, Adrian. Fuck off, Luka." "Oh, I got it right on the first take. I was contemplating for ages, how would Adrian tell someone to F off? That was perfect." Let's do it again. Let's do one more. So I know some of you are watching this bit just for the swearing. His dyed turquoise hair slicked back for the chic event, shook his head. That's not a good idea, Adrian. Fuck off, Luka. Oh, that was a bit more vitriol. That's not a good idea, Adrian. Fuck off, Luka. Yes. Where's Marinette? Luka asked. Adrian just scowled. Didn't I tell you to fuck off? Nailed it. I was really worried I wouldn't get either of them. Nailed them both first. Let's try a bit more vicious one. Where's Marinette? Luka asked. Adrian just scowled. Didn't I tell you to fuck off? That was too much. The first one's fine.